So glazes are comprised of various powdered materials that are mixed with water. And because there's just powder and water mixed together, they can settle out very easily where water comes to the surface and the powdered materials settle to the bottom. So we want to make sure that we mix our glazes frequently. We want to mix them really, really well when we first get them out, and then continuously mix them throughout the glazing process. Anytime we go to dip a piece in the glaze or to apply the glaze, we want to make sure that we mix it again right before we do that, because the glazes can settle very quickly within a few minutes. When mixing a glaze, it's really important that you mix all the way down at the very bottom. Scrape the wicks against the bottom of the bucket. If you can feel any thick material at the bottom of the bucket, you need to continue to mix and scrape. We want to make sure that every ingredient is mixed up inside of this glaze. So there are various ways that you can apply glaze. With a vessel like this, oftentimes it's easier to glaze the interior first by pouring glaze in, and then you can dip the exterior. So you can use a container like this. It's going to mix our glaze really well. Hold the piece above the bucket. Pour the glaze in quickly. Make sure that we get all the way around. Hold it above the bucket until it stops dripping. And then any areas that you might have missed, you can come in with a brush and touch those up. You want to work quickly. The longer the glaze sits inside of the cup, the thicker the glaze will get. You don't want it to be in there for more than 3 to 5 seconds. So fill it up and dump it out as quick as you can. Now, if I don't want these drips on the outside, I can come in with my sponge, some water, and wipe off this exterior. Now you can see this glaze is already dry. It only takes a few minutes, sometimes just 30 seconds or so for a glaze to dry. You know that it's dry because it isn't glossy anymore. I want to clean off my mixing utensils before I put them into another glaze. We want to be very careful not to contaminate our glazes. We don't want cross-contamination between different glazes. Now when applying glaze to the outside of this piece, I can brush glaze on, I can pour glaze with this tool onto the outside, or I can just dip the whole piece. For this piece, I think that I'll just dip the glaze. Now, because I have a nice even rim, if I hold this totally flat as I dip it, the air that's trapped inside will keep the glaze from going into the interior, and I can glaze just the exterior. A little bit will overlap though. You want to be conscious of where you're holding it because your fingers may leave a mark. And we want to dip in 1, 2, 3. So I'm going to go 1, 2, 3. I'm trying to get the glaze out of the foot ring. It will dry relatively quick. And then you can see that my wax resist kept the glaze from sticking to the pot. Now, after you've glazed, there will often be some glaze that sticks to the wax just a little bit. It's good to come in and wipe that off. Always make sure to wipe the very bottom of your piece. There will be a few drips of glaze on there. Make sure that it's perfectly clean, no excess glaze. Wipe around the bottom of the foot ring. This piece is clean and ready to go onto the appropriate glaze cart. Sometimes when glazing a piece, we want to dip the entire thing in one solid color. We have these tongs that allow you to hold the ceramic piece without leaving lots of fingerprints when you dip it in a glaze. So we can give our glaze a good mix right before we go to dip. And then hold the piece with the tongs. And if this is a vessel, we can dip in and then dump it out. So we'll dip just the same, 3 seconds. 1, 2, 3. Hold it above the bucket for it to drip. Then you can set your piece down to dry. The tongs sometimes will leave little blemishes, or you may, at any time when you're glazing, see bubbles on the surface or little cracks. You can just use your finger to buff that out and rub the glaze into the little divots and smooth it out. Another way to apply glaze is by brushing. When brushing glaze, you often want to have a hake brush or a bamboo brush that has a large amount of bristles that can hold a lot of glaze. So you can apply large amounts of glaze with each pass. When brushing glaze on, we don't want to brush real finicky. We want to lay glaze on and load up our brush again and lay some more glaze on. When brushing glaze on, we want to try to load up our brush and get even thick coats. Load it up. When brushing glaze, we typically want to apply at least 2 coats to get the right thickness. Wait for it to dry and come back and apply a second coat. There, I've painted the interior. And now I'd like to have this interior glaze come down around the rim a little bit. So I'm actually going to dip it just a little. Now I'm going to apply another glaze on the exterior. In the exterior glaze, I'm going to have it overlap this on the lip a little bit, and that's where they'll blend. You can layer up to 2 glazes. The glaze I'm going to put on the exterior of this piece is a crawl glaze. And crawl glazes are textured, and they actually can be applied thicker than normal glazes. The thicker they are, the more crawling will happen. So there are a few things that can go wrong when you're glazing, and one is if your glaze is too thick or the 2 glazes you're layering aren't compatible, the glaze might start to peel and flake. So this is an issue. If these flakes fall off and land on the kiln shelf, they can melt to the kiln shelf and ruin it. So it's important that we try to make sure that that glaze is adhered really well to the surface. Sometimes we might need to remove it and reapply. In this case, I'm going to try to make sure that those flakes come off so they don't fall off in the kiln. In some instances, you might need to scrape the glaze off or wash it off and then let your piece dry for a day before you reapply the glaze. Another surface decoration material I want to show you are oxide washes. Oxide washes are just the colorants that would be in a glaze, but they're only the colorant mixed with water. It can help you highlight details anywhere that you have a texture or fine details. The oxide wash can highlight that. This is an example of what it looks like on raw clay. This is what it looks like with glaze on top of it. So with an oxide wash, you apply it to the surface of the bisqueware and then you wipe it away, and it stains the surface, leaving residual stain inside of any texture that you might have. So we want to mix these up really well. Definitely wear gloves when working with oxide wash because of the ingredients will stain your skin. When working with oxide wash, we're going to apply the wash to the surface. And then we'll use our water and a sponge to wipe it away. If I didn't wipe this away, there's so much material on this surface that isn't going to melt and fuse to the clay. It'll remain powdery, even when it's fired, and it can make glaze not want to stick to this surface. So it's really important that you wipe the wash away if it's underneath of a glaze. So you can see how that wash has really amplified that texture. This can be applied to the surface of your raw bisqueware. Maybe you have underglaze that's been bisque fired on the surface. The wash can be a good way to add depth and diversity of colors. Now I can glaze on top of this, but because I used so much water to rinse that away, I want to let this dry for a while. It needs to be really dry before I apply glaze to it. So when you're adding wash and washing it away with water, you've made your bisqueware wet and you'll need to let it dry. Oxide wash can also be applied on top of glaze. And in this case, we'll just paint it on the glaze and we'll leave it there. You can use it to color a glaze by painting it all over. You can also use it to create designs on top of a glaze. And then that color will change the appearance of the glaze by adding color in those areas. Oxide wash can also be a good way to sign your work if you haven't already signed it. If you use a small brush in oxide wash, you can use it to apply your initials to the bottom, or your name, signature, or any sign. The oxide wash in small amounts like this can go on the bottom of your piece, and it won't make it adhere to the kiln shelf. But it has to be in small amounts. You can't paint the whole entire bottom with oxide wash and then just put it in the kiln. We'll leave that to dry. Other things that you might do with glaze is I can paint wax over top of a glaze and then apply another glaze onto this piece, and then I would have areas where the two glazes overlap and also areas where the wax is that you only see the first glaze. Now once my pieces are glazed and ready to be fired, I want to put them on the appropriate shelf in the kiln room. So if I've used low fire glaze, cone 05, 06, 04, I want to put those on the low fire cone 05 shelf. If I've been using cone 6 glazes, I'll put those on the cone 6 shelf. If I've been using cone 10 glazes, I'll put those on the cone 10 shelf. It's very important that you pay attention to the cone of the glaze that you're using and what shelf you put it on. Once I've put all my pieces on the right shelf in the kiln room, then I'm ready to start cleaning up. The first thing that I'll do is clean up all the materials that I was using and put those back in their place. So wiping off the containers, if there's any material on the exterior, cleaning off the buckets, put the test tiles back that we got out, make sure our brushes are all cleaned out really, really well. Any other utensils we use, we can take the mixing tools and our utensils to the sink and rinse those really, really well and put them back in place. And then the newspaper you use can be folded up and put in the trash. And finally, when you're all cleaned up and you've wiped off your table space, if you have a bucket of water that that you've been using for glaze, we want to pour this water off into the catchment bucket in the sink so we can collect that glaze material and dispose of it properly rather than pouring it down the drain. So before I wipe up my table space, I'm going to pour my water off into the catchment bucket in the sink, and then I'll get clean fresh water to wipe off my workspace.